I've been at the epicenter of all this value creation of the startup movement now for 15 years. So I've seen the good of it. I've seen the value that's been created, and I have seen the dark underbelly too. Companies that are being destroyed because of their own success. So many people are losing control of their companies. They're building products that ultimately wind up being malignant and harmful to their customers in contravention of their own values. And people are being told that this is just the way it is. There's nothing you can do. This is the inevitable price of scale or profit or whatever. And I think that's not true. In fact, I got the goods. I got the research to prove it. And I've spent the last decade of my life building something called the long-term stock exchange, building all kinds of startups that are designed to try to change the philosophy of business that's causing this really malignant problem. Hey, everybody. Yeah, Eric Ries. You may remember me from such hits as The Lean Startup, or if you're in the corporate innovation world, you probably know me more as the author of The Startup Way. But either way, longtime entrepreneur and author, founder of LTSE and Answer AI, and the Virgil startup law firm, and a bunch of other things, trying to change how startups are built.
Eric, I'm honored that you're on the show. I've been thinking a lot about my experience with the concept of MVP over the many years that the book's been out. And when I first got the email about for us to start, coordinating this interview, my first thought was like, oh, this is time to close the gap and stuff. But then as I did research, there's plenty of material on that stuff. And it's a little bit funny. I don't know if you know about the movie, The Life of Brian from Monty Python,
Sure.
but if
Yeah.
listener, if you haven't seen The Life of Brian, there's really funny clips. It's just like this guy that gets mistaken for the Messiah, and then everyone's taking everything he says way too seriously, and he's like, wait, that's not what I meant. And I can only imagine the issues behind that, but starting a movement.
Yep.
But I just want to get this out of the way since AI has come around, and I did product management for a little bit, but now when AI got really good, run Claude Sonnet
Yeah.
3.5, I'm like, I'm going back into design. This is so fun. It's around Figma Make when they gave you unchecked usage.
Yeah.
If we're thinking about double diamond, AI really compresses that first diamond of coming up with a hypothesis. And then it's just make as many concepts as you can and test them and really refine it. And so you were right the whole time about MVPs. It's just really hard to come up with something to test. And now it's not that hard. And I'm coming into this interview from a week of just frying my brain doing back-to-back concept tests with a research team. I'm making updates to the prototype and then trying it in the next interview and then refining it and doing 4 different versions within 72 hours. And just being like, oh, wow, we just saved the company a bunch of money because the whole premise that went into this project was to validate a really bad assumption. And we just found out that assumption's not correct, but we found a different angle of how we could approach this offer just through a landing page concept prototype of testing out an offer.
A classic, an old-timey classic. Yeah.
It makes the concept of MVP like an experiment more relevant now. And I just want to say, I'm not going to ask you to explain yourself. I think in the age of AI, there's no excuse not to experiment.
It certainly has gotten a lot easier. And it's funny because people used to use the difficulty of it as an excuse not to do it. And those same people have just moved on to different excuses now. Yeah, you can't win them all. It's okay. But by the way, a lot of people become lean startup converts on their second startup. I don't mind.
The pain stops when you learn the lesson.
I hope so. For some people, anyway.
For some people. Yeah, some people are stubborn. I'm going to do a very meta question here, is that I feel like the lean startup for you was your MVP into the world of management theory.
Yeah, that's right.
And you've been iterating on your thesis and premise. Now, I've gotten a little bit into your next book. Could you tell me a little bit about what's happened since you've written Lean Startup to your next book? What is your next book? What is the overall thesis behind it? And how did the last 10 years influence you deciding to write it in the first place?
Yeah, the new book is called Incorruptible: Why Good Companies Go Bad and How Great Companies Stay Great. And I've been at the epicenter of all this value creation of the startup movement now for 15 years. So I've seen the good of it. I've seen the value that's been created, and I have seen the dark underbelly too. Companies that are being destroyed because of their own success. So many people are losing control of their companies. They're building products that ultimately wind up being malignant and harmful to their customers in contravention of their own values. And people are being told that this is just the way it is. There's nothing you can do. This is the inevitable price of scale or profit or whatever. And I think that's not true. In fact, I got the goods. I got the research to prove it. And I've spent the last decade of my life building something called the long-term stock exchange, building all kinds of startups that are designed to try to change the philosophy of business that's causing this really malignant problem. And I'll tell you a funny story. I was at a dinner the other day with a group of friends, and we were traveling, so we were away from home. Went to two different restaurants, two different nights. First night, someone had said, "Oh, we haven't been there in a long time, but this place is good. Trust me." I said, "Great." We got there. The person who recommended it took one bite of the food and was like, "Did private equity take over this restaurant?" I literally looked it up on his phone and was like, "Yeah, sorry guys. I didn't realize they'd been bought up by private equity. That's why the food sucks." And everyone's like, "Yeah, you can taste it when that happens." Anyway, we went to dinner the next night, different restaurant, different person recommended, got down, took one bite. The person was like, "Is this the same damn private equity firm?" Like they looked it up. "Oh, no, it's a different firm, but the taste is the same. What is going on?" We've all had this experience of companies that get acquired, that go public, they get bought out, where just like they lose that special spark, what made them worth backing and trusting in the first place. And since I know you have a lot of founders who are listening to the show, I tell a story in the book of a founder who came to me for advice, and he was trying to figure out, like, how can I bind my company? How can I make sure that the technology we develop is only used to like help cure people and not to kill them? It was a very serious question from a serious entrepreneur. And at the same time as I was trying to help him and talk to him about this issue, I was also about to go to this event in honor of a different founder of mine who'd been an entrepreneur for 10 or 15 years. Like, was at the end of his entrepreneurial journey. And I was like, "Look, sorry, I can't talk right now. I got to go to this event." I told him about the founder and we're going to go there. And I was watching people stream into the event. I'm like, "Look, there's people at this event who like this founder had to fire and they've come back to celebrate." Okay. And the guy was like, "Mad respect. That's so rare. That's the kind of company I want to be in." I'm like, "You're not hearing me, man. This isn't a party. It's a wake. He doesn't work there anymore." And he's like, "What?" Yeah. Even though he made all this money for all his investors, they wanted more and they've ousted him. And he was like, "Is that gonna happen to me someday?" Because the very issue was he was trying to promise people. They would say like, "How do I know you're not gonna use this technology for something terrible?" He'd be like, "I have such good intentions." "Yeah, but don't you have investors? What if the investors pressured you to do the wrong thing?" He'd be like, "I would tell them no. If you're a for-profit company, can't they just fire you anytime?" So he's like, "Wait a minute, is that gonna be me someday? When I get in the way of my investors making an extra buck, are they gonna fire me?" I was like, "Yeah, that's what I've been trying to tell you this whole conversation. This whole system, by default, unless you take the protective action early, this is what happens to you." And he was like, "Is it possible?" And he put it to me this way. He's like, "Is it possible to build an incorruptible organization?" And I was like, "Good news, bad news kind of situation. Yes, it is possible. I will tell you how. But bad news is you've already taken some of the steps in the wrong direction. So if you don't want this to be you, we need to already reverse course and fix some of the errors that you've made." So that's been my daily life now for many years, trying to figure out how do we help people not just build something worth protecting, but then to actually protect it so that when the pressure comes, when the temptation comes, when the rain comes, the roof is still there.
I've been actually one of your first chapters, like the first chapter of the book, you talk about the story of Saul Price, who is the mentor to Jim Senegal, the founder of Costco, and it tells the story about like one of the prototypical, I guess, the MVP version of Costco, a FedMart, and how he makes the company so much money, he gets acquired, and then the board ousts him
Yeah.
because they don't want him to operate it the way that he wants to operate it. They want to extract value, and the I, I it was just serendipitous because I've been listening to founders podcast, like it's like true crime for people that like entrepreneurial stories.
Yeah.
And I one of the things that the founders podcast host talks about a lot is he loves quoting like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. And one of the principles is that most things come down to incentives, is why bad behavior happens. You could put a good person in a bad system and the
Yeah,
outcome will always be bad.
yeah,
I like to think about like, oh, why do people misunderstand, like, for example, the concept of an MVP? But then you look at like the incentives that the head of product or whatever gives to a team of product managers that are building the roadmap, and that like their bonus structure is determined by how many features they ship.
yeah.
Then they'll never do the MVP concept correctly
Of
because
course
the
not.
incentives are wrong. What are some of the incentives that lead to these like bad governance structures in companies?
Yeah, I'll tell you a story, a heartbreaking story, but I think it's important to understand because the steps that founders and leaders, product managers for that matter, take tend to be woefully naive and inadequate to preventing the things they're trying to prevent. And to see how this in action, it's helpful to go back a little further than Saul Price. You go back to Robert Wood Johnson II. He was the second generation owner of Johnson and Johnson, and he inherited the company from his father in the depths of the Depression. So he um, was the kind of leader who would invest in factories at a time when others were pulling back. He would pay people more when other people were cutting wages. Like he really believed in a very particular business philosophy and ethos of business. He was so successful that when the depression ended, Johnson and Johnson roared back because he had made these investments when everyone else was cutting back. So he was having a lot of success, and so he planned to take the company public during World War II, by the way. That's how hardcore he was. But even in the 1940s, he was worried that Johnson and Johnson would lose its way as a public company. So he created what a very famous document called the Johnson and Johnson Our Credo, which laid out the fiduciary commitments of the Johnson Corporation. First commitment was to patients, then to doctors and nurses, then to employees, then to communities, and investors last. The exact opposite of what we now teach as the corporate governance best practice. And he was worried that people would forget about the credo. So to solve the problem, he had it carved into 10-foot high limestone blocks and installed in corporate headquarters where they still exist to this day. The idea was that every person who works there would have to walk by the credo on their way in and out of work, and they'd be reminded of what the company stands for. But unfortunately, that is not enough. Even though the company proudly displays the credo, in fact, to this day, Johnson is, in their marketing is always talking about the credo as a very important part of their document. Over time, the metrics and incentives became misaligned as the company fell into the gravity well of modern best practices around shareholder primacy, about quarterly growth, about earnings targets, and all the rest. Over time, the same managers who preached the credo started to do a bunch of unethical stuff. And the company was rocked by many scandals. They had product recalls, had defective medicines, they did all kinds of stuff. I think the very worst of the scandals, although it's hard to pick, was the time that they allowed baby powder to be sold that was mixed with cancerous asbestos. And then they tried to cover it up. We know that they tried to cover it up, by the way, because of course these things always come out in litigation, and now we have the internal documents. So the same people the same people who put asbestos in the baby powder and tried to cover it up, walked by the credo every day. So they
Mhm.
thought somehow that this compliance with the metric was somehow aligned with the credo. They figured, I'm sure, that somebody at a higher pay grade had all worked it out and they were doing the right thing. That's how dangerous misaligned incentives can be. And unfortunately, not only do we have an economy that rewards companies for this bad behavior, they reward the executives who oversee it. Many of the executives who oversaw the company during the periods of these massive scandals walked away with tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation. So this modern business philosophy that we all come to live in, that puts investors first, that preaches extraction of value rather than the creation of value, I think that whole way of doing business is corrupt. And I think most founders agree. Most founders are afraid that this is going to happen to them. And we're supposed to pretend that we think it's okay, that we think all ways of making money are equally good, but we don't. No one who makes products for a living really thinks that. We think the best way to make money is what I call the builder's intuition, that you should create new value in the world and then just capture some of it for yourself, leaving the world better off than you found it. So I think it's time for us as builders to reclaim that intuition and put it at the center of all of the things that we do.
Yeah, Lenny in his podcast, he was just talking to Mark Andreessen, and Mark's rehashing like the whole thesis behind A16Z, and he talks about how The whole thesis is that like the founder led company is always going to do better because the founder usually is a missionary, believes in like what they're doing and are willing to do it with no visible evidence that they're going to succeed for a long period of time. And starting in the 80s, the whole concept that a well-trained manager could airdrop into any company. And I think it's proven out that that's not true. It's like whenever like a professional CEO comes in, the default outcome is failure.
Yeah, it's super sad actually. Like in the book, I give 200 years of case studies of this phenomenon. Like
Yeah.
boards constantly like, I want to oust the founder. They want to oust values-driven leadership and bring in some corporate shill. And what's funny is a lot of the stories are like stories of founder misconduct. Okay. So Edward Land at Polaroid very
Mhm.
famously like overinvested in a technology that didn't work out and left the company in bad shape. So the board, of course, fired him to bring in professional managers. And what's so interesting about these moments is sometimes everyone can agree that the founder should be fired, but like then they actually make the problem worse, not better. Because it's like we have a really strong sense of accountability for founders, but we don't have nearly the same sense of accountability for professional CEOs. Like, why is that? We have the same, like we reward people if they cut costs, but then we don't hold them accountable for the consequences to the brand or the product of those cost-cutting actions. So I think a lot of modern business is full of these double standards. And what's interesting to me is nominally a lot of these rules and procedures and best practices, they're supposed to be about maximizing shareholder value, but they're not actually good for shareholders either. Like founder-driven companies outperform conventional companies. And since 2008, companies that have been rated to have good governance have have underperformed companies that are rated to have bad governance. So we're indoctrinating a whole generation of leaders and managers and board members into a set of practices that are being enacted in the name of shareholder value that are in fact harmful to shareholders themselves.
It's very sobering. If you look at all the founder stories, even before your book was published, you know, Phil Knight, the MVP was him selling Onitsuka tigers from the back of his van at like track meets. Like the minimum viable offering was retail of someone else's product to the right like segment. And then with 5 years before he even got a retail deal, he had 70% of the runners market because he believed in running and the having good equipment for running.
Yeah.
And tough thing is like it's one thing to, and maybe that is part of like I'll use like your metaphor of like starting a religion based off of it, is that usually like the prophet becomes a martyr really quick. Maybe that's part of like being a missionary is being willing to not see the ideal version come through. But you've advised a lot of startups. What maybe like if like a founder's listening, like what's like the reframe of the game, I'd say, because at the end of the day, this is just a game. There's rules you have to follow and operate within. Ideally, if you figure out good marketing segments and it's an offer that you're willing to work on indefinitely, you could do a pretty good job. Like, what's the reframe that prevents them from getting thrown into the meat grinder, so to speak?
So the reframe is this. And when I first say it, people, I think, get a little bit worried. Is this really doable? But it is. It's okay. You can do it. Reframe is this. What it means to make a profit, to be a for-profit organization, is actually about maximizing human flourishing, leaving people better off because you existed than if you had never existed. And this simple idea fixes a whole bunch of these problems. It turns out that companies that are committed to some higher principle, like quality, like beauty, or even something complicated like fixing climate change or eradicating poverty or whatever, they have these incredible advantages over conventional companies. And if you've never worked in a mission driven company, this can sound futuristic or even impossible. Like, how could it ever be that a company could be, how do I put this? That a company could have such alignment of everyone it touches, its customers, its employees, its investors, everyone rowing in the same direction. It's like the equivalent for an organization of the flow state that a person can get into. Believe me, I've seen it. And the advantages are immense. So, in order to activate those advantages, we have to be aligned with a mission that people can feel in their heart that they actually really want to be part of. And so when you reframe that way, then you can start to ask, okay, which of the governance practices, which of the cultural practices, which of the management practices we've all been taught are really value maximizing? Which are the ones that are going to allow us to activate these superpowers? And when you do that, it's very obvious that many of them are value destroying, that we're wasting too much time on practices that really don't have a lot of evidence to defend them. So then in the book, I lay out the whole blueprint of how to do this differently. And just like in Lean Startup, it's not a work of theory. It is a work of individual techniques, each of which is good in itself, but which, when work together, create a system that can protect an organization over the long term.
Eric, I want to respect your time. What do you feel like hasn't been said that should be said on the record before we sign off?
Sure, sure, sure. Let me tell one more story
Yeah.
because I feel like it's important to be concrete about these things. You talked about Saul Price and the betrayal that he had. But in the 1920s, there was a woman in Denmark named Marie Crow, and she contracted diabetes at a time when that was a fatal diagnosis. There was no cure for diabetes. But her husband was a Nobel winner. He just won the Nobel Prize. And so she agreed to go with him to America, to North America, for a lecture tour, even though she had this disease. And so they traveled from Denmark to the United States. He was traveling around doing lectures. And at dinner, at one of the dinners, the scientist she was sitting next to at the table told her about this breakthrough that had happened in Canada, that someone had figured out how to synthesize insulin, which could potentially be a cure for diabetes. She was pretty excited, obviously. She convinces her husband that they should extend their tour of North America, travel to Canada, and go see this technology for themselves. And they do. They get there. They're super excited because, of course, here is a drug that could save her life. But they don't just want to save one life. They want to save a lot of lives. And they say, look, we want to commercialize this technology back in Denmark, bring this cure home so that in Denmark, diabetes will no longer be a fatal diagnosis. They work out a deal with the Canadians to license the technology, but they're all very worried that if you're making a life-saving therapy for somebody, it's okay to make money from that. You should get paid for that. That's good. You could charge them a fair price, no problem. But what if someday in the future, somebody sees that relationship that we have, that I can save your life with this drug? Couldn't I use that to ask you for anything I wanted? Wouldn't that give me power over you? Wouldn't you pay me anything to get it? Years before Martin Shkreli, these guys understood that this was a danger with pharmaceuticals. And because they saw science as a public trust, they made an agreement with the Canadians that as part of the license to bring the technology to Denmark, they would embody the company in what they called the Nordisk Insulin Laboratorium, a nonprofit foundation that owned a for-profit subsidiary. This is the structure called an industrial foundation in governance circles. It is the structure behind not just Novo Nordisk, but IKEA, Hershey, and so many companies you've interacted with without realizing it. Now, what's interesting about this structure is it has endured for more than 100 years. It has shepherded Novo Nordisk through many ups and downs and many of the kinds of betrayals that would have destroyed the company, like that destroyed FedMart, Saul Price's FedMart. And yet, because it has this structure, it's a lot more stable. It's not the only company in the world with this structure. It's actually common enough that there's a whole body of academic research that studies it. And good news, companies with this structure are 6 times more likely to last 50 years than conventionally structured companies. Here's why I tell this story last. When you're a founder, if you talk to your lawyers or your bankers or your investors or almost anyone in your life and you say, hey, I heard this story about Novo Nordisk, I want to do that too. I want my company to last 100 years. They'll be like, oh, no, that's an old fashioned thing from Denmark. We don't do that anymore. We have a much better set of best practices. And the people who give this advice about all these practices, they seem smart. They're well credentialed. They went to law school. They went to business school. They seem real smart. And I always tell founders, you indeed may be very smart. These advisors may indeed be very smart. But are you sure you're smarter than a Nobel laureate? Because August and Marie Crow worked this out more than 100 years ago, and it seems to be working pretty well. And I think we are teaching founders a very narrow slice of what is possible. And it's time for us to open our eyes and say, look, there are actually more forms, more structures, more opportunities to build what I call mission-controlled companies that can embody the commitment to human flourishing, not just over quarters, but over years, decades, or even centuries. And so I encourage everybody who is interested to check out the book at incorruptible.co and see how to do this. And hopefully we'll form a movement together just like we did for Lean Startup.
I can't think of a better trailer for the book. Eric, thank you so much for taking the time. The real like wrinkle in my brain that you just developed is I, it might just be a lack of imagination on what's possible with governance. I don't think that's like something that's really talked about that often.
Oh, no, it certainly isn't.
I think I really admire that this is like the next step in like your body of work. And I highly recommend anyone that's listening to listen to this. And I will shoot you an email when I finish it with my thoughts.
I can't wait to hear it. I can't wait to hear it. Excellent. Thanks. Appreciate you helping me getting the word out about the book, and thanks for the kind words.
Hey, listener, thanks again for listening to The Way of Product. As we power down today's session on the fusion of creativity and technology, let's solidify the energy you've gotten from our dialogue today. If you've gleaned insights or strategies that could turbocharge your projects, I have a small but powerful ask. Swing by the platform where you're hearing this and leave a review. Think of it as your digital high five to us. It's a fuel that propels this content to more creative technologists like you, amplifying the impact of the shared knowledge. So until our next interview, keep pioneering and pushing the envelope. Thanks again for lending your ears and your imagination to our community. Catch you on the next download.